Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. Are you ready to rock and roll?
Yeah, I'm ready to rock and roll now. The caffeine's kicking in, so I'm shifting out of the country western genre into rock and roll now.
I see. Good. Well, I think some folks out there thought we were done with feeding, but we're not. We're back, and we have a variety of topics that we want to cover. Some of them overlap with the previous episode on feeding. And we also have a couple of things that don't, new information. And it was driven by, this episode's driven by a couple of things. One, if you remember, I thought that I had found a paper on turkeys from South Texas at some point, and I could not find it again. And then you, through the airwaves, asked Jason Harden to find it. Well, it turns out he had the paper.
He's still listening to us.
I know. Yeah. Kudos to him for listening.
Glutton for punishment, huh?
Yeah. I don't know why you're still listening, but we appreciate you. But he had the paper on file, or at least the thesis that was associated with it, and sent it to us, asking, is that what we were talking about? And that prompted us to actually find the peer-reviewed publication on turkeys. So I want to cover that today.
Yeah.
Because I think it's important for us to basically present to people all the evidence that's out there, regardless of the direction or quality of it. We're trying to be open about it, and that is a data point that we want to talk about.
Yeah.
The other thing that prompted some of the stuff we're going to cover today is, I don't know if you remember when we were talking about it, I asked you, or you asked me, if there was anything on adult predation for any species.
Associated with feeders.
Yeah, associated with feeders or feeding. And I had not found anything, and I think you said the same. You had not looked for it or found anything incidentally. So I actually went back and tried to find it. And I dug up a fair amount of literature that I was unaware of. None of it is on turkeys, but there's quite a few things that I found pretty interesting that might be important to think about when we're thinking about how feeders might affect turkeys.
So it's on other species of birds.
Yeah, everything is. For one reason or another, I don't know why. We basically don't have anything other than this one paper on turkeys. Aside from some things that, like disease stuff that's relevant to turkeys, that we've covered, or the aflatoxins. Obviously, those things are relevant to turkeys, but in terms of actually connecting feeding practices to demography or behavior of turkeys, there's basically nothing.
Yeah, well, Jason, he sent us that paper, and it actually started kind of an email conversation that we've had over the past couple of days. And we started talking about with him, research ideas for how we could address this, and, why it would be interesting to know, discussion of a little bit of, the standard practices that are being implemented in his state and elsewhere. And then, I posed the question to him because he mentioned, there oftentimes isn't a lot of interest in funding studies related to things like feeding. And, I had my notions of why that might be, but I wanted to see what his perspective was as a state agency biologist. And the thing that he brought up is that we do have a lot of other important topics related to habitat and things like that and we don't want to shift attention away from those, which I totally agree with.
Yeah.
I would way rather, I think it's more important to be doing habitat research versus feeding research. But he also made the point that, this is a cultural practice that is going to be implemented, that is being implemented on a wide scale basis, and probably not going away in many places for a long time, if ever. So I think it's probably important to understand,
Yeah.
how it affects wildlife biology, including
Yeah.
turkeys.
I agree. I Given the scale that this is operating at globally, which I have a few fun facts that I wanted to throw out because I kind of got into some really interesting stuff globally. Uh, Given the scale of the practice and the fact that, I mean, just about every turkey probably has access
Mm-hmm.
to some sort of provision,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is certainly relevant
Yeah.
now, and I think it's not just relevant because it's all bad. There's probably context dependence where the relative effects or value of the practice change, which
Mm-hmm.
is, I think, something we'll get into here in a few minutes. But yeah, I agree. It's something that is worthy of us exploring it to try to understand what the implications are, positive or negative.
Yeah.
Like if there are ways that it can be positive, we should explore that and make sure that we understand that context.
Well, I mean, we've made that promise at the outset of this podcast, is that we were going to present data that we had, regardless of the direction that it points.
Right.
So, if we have data that shines a positive light on feeding, we got to share that. Just like when
Yeah.
we were largely negative on the impacts of predator control on turkey populations, turkey recruitment, but we also presented some data that showed that
Hmm.
in some cases it may be positive, and
Yeah.
we make sure to caveat all that within the appropriate context.
Right. This issue and the trapping one are, I think, two of the best examples of this. We've been pretty negative about feeding up till right now, and I think that is warranted based on the propensity
Hmm.
of evidence. But we're not going to avoid evidence that's contrary to that, which is why we're here again. And I kind of expected that. I think we said it while we were working on the trapping one. I kind of expected that approach to make everybody mad. Like we're gonna have people that are supporting a practice
Hmm.
or whatever or a hypothesis, and then people that are opposing it. And these two issues, I think, are those types of topics where people are pretty firm in their camp. And I thought we would make both of them mad, and it seems like it's going the other way.
Hmm.
People are glad that we're trying to be objective and present all the evidence to you and let you decide. Uh,
Well, maybe
I
that speaks to the cross section of turkey hunters that are our audience.
Yeah, I agree. We're trying to be as open as we can, even when we don't like it.
Yeah.
So
Speaking of our audience, before we start
you got a
and
shout out.
get into all the facts, my wife listened to the first full episode that she's listened to since, I think, episode 1 or 2, and I don't think she ever finished either of those first couple of episodes. So she listened to she wanted to hear more about, of course I shared a lot of stories with her about our Nebraska trip, but she wanted to hear the episode that we recorded on it to find out more. And she was she came to me that evening after she had been listening to it on and off throughout the day, and she finished it. And she said, kind of in a surprised voice, that she really enjoyed it. And I said, "Oh,
Uh,
so you were surprised that it was entertaining?"
yeah, good for you.
And she was like,
You brought her
"No."
over.
She was like, "No, the dynamic has really improved over time." And I said, "Yeah, there's something to that for sure."
Yeah,
So
we're hearing that a lot.
that was just a kind of little bit of a funny story that I thought I'd share before we got down into the serious stuff today.
It has not improved enough for my family to jump on the wagon. I don't think there is a single person that I'm related to or married to or any of that.
Well, she
Listening.
particularly appreciated the conversation pertaining to the ditchweed.
Yeah. Well,
and
see,
your
I
joke about
told,
doves flying high.
yeah. Well, I told that joke at home, and it went over like a lead balloon.
Oh man,
It just didn't work out.
we got to work on your family sense of humor.
I know. Well, I think yeah, maybe it just works better when it's coming through electrons. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, potty humor and
That's
drug
the only humor that works around my house.
potty humor and drug humor apparently is a big hit around here.
Yeah. Well, I thought we visited the scale of feeding, and we were really focused on the southeast. And I thought that would be a good place for us to start here, and let's take a perspective outside of the southeastern United States. So when I was trying to find information on how feeders might affect predation in something, I was just looking for, is there any data on this, on any species? I got it really deep into the bird feeder literature, which is not somewhere I spend a lot of time.
Who knew that even existed, the bird feeder literature?
Well, there were some things in it that really just blew my mind.
Mm-hmm.
One of those things was, well, first of all, feeding birds is the most popular thing globally of any kind of feeding, which makes sense.
Other than feeding ourselves, I guess.
Yeah, well, I'm talking about wildlife. Bird feeders are everywhere, right? I mean, most people have a house. In fact, it's quantified. It is most people. It's 73% of households in the United States have some sort of bird feeding. Whether in it that includes water as well, like a little bird bath.
Do you feed your birds?
No, I don't. Well, I do, not with a feeder or a water source or anything, but I've got a pokeweed forest around my house that birds just wear out.
Yeah, what was that we were calling? We were talking about your place on the way back from Nebraska. And I said you need to start calling it Pokeweed Manor. Yeah, I think I'll go down
I heard MANNER, but I think you meant MANOR, didn't you?
Yeah, it's getting late in the evening. I better return to Pokeweed Manor.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah.
Well, I'm guilty. I feed birds, so I guess I can't criticize people for putting out corn if I feed birds. Is that true?
Well, that not only is the scale pretty impressive, it's 73% of households in the U.S., which is about 500,000 tons of food put in bird feeders every year.
Well, actually, my wife and kids put most of the bird feed out. So
yeah. Well, the reason I'm pointing that out is one of the papers that I found was written by Cox and Gaston, and it was in 2018. It's called Human Nature Interactions and the Consequences and Drivers of Provisioning Wildlife. It's almost entirely focused on birds, but there's a little bit of other stuff in there. In that paper, they kind of set up the whole point that we have this extinction of experience, is what they were calling it in the paper. And the idea is that a lot of people just don't have access to nature.
Mm.
And there's well-documented consequences to that.
Mm-hmm.
Like people
nature
aren't
deficit disorder.
Healthy. Yes.
Famous book from 15 years ago or so.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of work on this, but interacting with nature, and I think a lot of our audience will probably relate to this. You know how rejuvenating it is for you to get out in the woods and spend a lot of time in nature alone, just kind of getting it done, right?
You get
Chasing
centered,
a turkey or whatever.
Centered and focused.
Yeah, and I value that part of hunting a lot, but a lot of people on the planet don't have any sort of interaction like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they were kind of setting it up as, we need to understand the consequences of these actions, whether positive or negative, but we also need to understand why people are doing it. And they kind of focused on that part.
Yeah.
And it turns out based on what they were saying in that paper, that it is that concentration of activity at attraction of species to the home is sort of serving that role
I can
where it's
see
letting
that.
people engage in nature.
I can see that. I mean, I know when my wife and kids, they oftentimes put out bird seed together. We don't keep it out all the time, but every now
Yeah.
and then they think about it and they'll go out and fill out a couple feeders that we have. And then the one feeder we do maintain all the time is a hummingbird feeder that's right off
Hmm.
our back porch. You can see it from our kitchen table. And
Yeah.
my kids love seeing the hummingbirds come to eat, while we're sitting
Right.
there eating breakfast or dinner or whatever. And so I could see that inspiring, you know, a love of nature in
Hmm.
kids and adults.
Well, and, I'm when I go back to my family's place, my parents have a number of bird feeders, and you want to talk about somebody being tickled about it? My dad loves to brag about how much he has to fill those hummingbird feeders.
Yeah,
Like he brags about how fast they drink it down,
yeah,
and it's like 10 of them.
yeah,
And I listened to him, but I also have enjoyed seeing 10,000 hummingbirds trying to get on the
right,
porch.
right,
I mean, it's literally such a ridiculous number of them that it is fun,
yeah,
and I get it. So I'm with you on that. I don't have any feeders at my house, and I've kind of taken a hard line on that with my family. But I'm cultivating pokeweed around every window and other fruit bearing plants. But that's the one that's most impressive around the house, and we get the same kind of experience from watching them in the pokeweed bushes.
that's some serious dedication that you draw a hard line on bird feeding around your house. I'm just gonna make a comment right there because
Yeah,
I don't know that anyone I've ever talked to has said that before, or that I'll ever hear it again.
yeah. Well, probably not. But there's only a few places that I've drawn a line in the sand, and that's one of them. So
Can
I
can
don't.
you briefly explain your champion pokeweed?
What do you
Because when you were
mean?
telling me about your champion, it's a state champion pokeweed.
Oh, yes. So I moved into the house that we're in 4 years ago, a little over that now. And when we got the house, of course, the the yard was all well manicured. Right, it's the typical
Mhm,
suburban yard. We live on the edge of a protected area. There's various land holdings, so it's not just one type of protected area, but essentially public land, and then
mhm,
a few private in holdings of undeveloped land. So we're kind of in a neighborhood, but we're at the end where two sides of our house are natural areas. And I have done a few things trying to basically shift the plant community back to more like early succession instead of yard everywhere that you can't see from the
mhm.
road.
Right.
So that's been a process, and I have a lot of fun. I tinker around with things, trying to make basically good brooding cover in the backyard. But the spring after we moved in, so it was about 3 years ago, uh, a pokeweed plant germinated and started coming up in the flower bed. So I took note of that immediately, and of course I actually cleaned out all the flowers and all the stuff that was planted in there to give it some space. Like we're about to see how this thing goes, but that first year it got maybe 6 or 7 feet tall. I mean, impressive for the first year,
Mhm.
and then and it's in full sunlight right up against the house. Now it actually touches the house on a couple of the limbs on one side, but it's probably 5 or 6 foot from the wall, but full sun. And the second year, it was on April 2nd, I believe. I did a little prescribed burn around it at, after it had grown 4 or 5 feet because I
Did you
wanted to
rake
see
out
how.
around the base of your pokeweed so you didn't burn
Yeah.
it up?
Yeah, no, no, I was trying to top kill it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I actually did the opposite. I raked up some pine straw and put it around it and then burned it.
So you're burning within 5 or 6 feet of your house.
Yeah.
Okay. Just making sure.
It's not like I was, ringing the house in.
It was a low intensity backing fire.
Yes. So anyway, I was just curious. I put a time lapse on it to see how fast it could grow.
So you did top kill it?
Oh yeah, top killed it in a big way. Did not like it. So it re-sprouted, and there were several stems coming up from the base of it, and I put up a ruler basically beside it so that it was inch graduations, and then had a time lapse camera to see how fast, and I had it set to take a picture at like noon every day or something. And it grew like 4 inches a day.
Holy
I mean, it
moly.
was just unbelievable. And this is a 2-year-old plant. So it got up to maybe 10 or 12 feet tall still that day or that year after I top killed it. It had gotten up to about 4 foot, and I top killed it. So I just really appreciated that. And I can't help but be a scientist and kind of tinkering around with things that I study and trying to understand. But the other thing I found really noteworthy is it still produced a lot of fruit, or what I thought was a lot of fruit. So, the birds were using it readily. Well, by the next year, I didn't do anything again. So this is this previous year. The plant, I measured it. I got on a ladder and measured it because it was a champion pokeweed plant by now, and it had like 5 stems, and the tallest one it was a little over 14 foot tall. It's like, what? It's like a tree now.
2 kids are out there climbing pokeweed.
Yeah. So, and it must have produced a million fruit. It was just, just unbelievable. So we had all kinds of birds using it that fall. I forget what the hurricane was that came through. It knocked the plant over in front of our window, and I sat there with my kids, and we counted all the bird species using it during the hurricane while it was, the trees are blowing like crazy outside, and it blew this pokeweed over, and there was like 15 bird species using it all at once. It was crazy. So we've been enjoying it, just like you would a bird feeder.
Yeah.
But this year it peaked out a little over 14 foot again. And this year it really had a lot of fruit. But now it was sort of the parent plant. Now they're popping up all over the place, and every one that pops up, we just start letting it go. So I've got, a couple dozen probably now that are fruiting.
Yeah.
So anyway, I feel
Manor.
like we spent the whole episode talking about a pokeweed plant in the yard when we're supposed to be talking turkeys. We have started seeing turkeys in the yard, though.
Oh, cool.
We've had a couple of hens come out in the yard.
Yeah.
So, and also doves, they're coming in, landing under that. I did another little prescribed fire experiment under another pokeweed plant, not to top kill it, but just kind of removing some brush. And they've been wearing that bad boy out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Here this fall.
I was telling you, I got a little area in my side yard I'm going to try to do some of that stuff with. Do a little burning and plant a native orange. Well, I've already got some really nice little blue stem coming up over there, and I'm going to try to seed in some forbs.
Yeah. That's cool.
Anyway.
Yeah. Well, I mean, never stop learning. So I don't get to go out and be on the farm every day. So I'm tinkering around in the backyard because that's what I have access to, and I encourage folks to do that. Anyway, that seems to be one of the driving factors, like this thirst for nature that's leading people to use bird feeders. The stuff in the UK is pretty wild. They call their backyard gardens over there. So in their garden, they actually don't have the percentage of people. Wait, yeah, it's almost 50% of households have bird feeders, and that equates to 1 bird feeder for every 9 feeder using birds. In the UK, there's insane. 1 bird feeder for every 9 birds.
That would use a feeder.
Yeah. Yeah, I cannot. When I saw that, I felt like we had to mention it. Yeah. That's pretty incredible. This paper Cox and Gaston that I mentioned calculated this out, or found some references that calculated out. So we'll put this in the show notes if you want to go look at it for yourself. The amount of feed in terms of resources was enough to feed 3 times the breeding populations of 10 songbird species that use feeders. And that,
good grief.
if they ate nothing else except for bird feed, they would have 3 times as much food as they needed to sustain the population.
I don't know if you ever came across anything like this, and I know we've got more papers to cover, but I was taught many years ago that because bird feeders represent such a significant food resource on the landscape, that they tend to benefit resident species of birds
Mm-hmm.
and short distance migrants compared to neotropical migrants, because you've got, that food resource being provided throughout the winter time when those neotropical
Mm-hmm.
migrants aren't here in the southeast, and then the neotropical migrants return and the populate to an area where these short distance birds and these resident birds have been being propped up by the
Mm-hmm.
feed all winter long.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything to that, or if you
No,
came
there's
across
there's
anything
a
like
fair
that, but
amount. There's a fair amount of literature on that topic.
okay,
It's not always bad for the migrants, but that's the general sentiment I got from
gotcha.
digging around in it. It does also sometimes short stop them or stop them from migrating.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a couple of studies on that. Most of this is in Europe, but there's been a fair number of studies. The paper Robb et al. That was looking at ecological change for avian populations associated with feeding.
Mm-hmm.
They said, based on their take home from the literature review, which again, we're going to put all these in there if you want to go look at it, feeding influences almost every aspect of bird ecology, and they included reproduction, behavior, demography, and distribution. So that the Cox and Gaston paper actually went through and
Mm-hmm.
kind of summarized
Yeah.
what all those things are.
Yeah, I saw
And
that.
one of the major ones, and this is with songbirds on bird feeders, one of the major things that was positive that you see is adult overwintering survival increase.
Mm-hmm.
But they also often see earlier lay dates and increased egg and clutch size.
Mm-hmm. But that was just one paper that found that they cited, right?
Yeah, they have one paper cited for the increased egg and clutch
Mm-hmm.
sizes, but there are multiple ones
Okay.
on different species. I think this one is on sparrows or something that the text that I clipped for you to see. But the other thing is the how feeding affects breeding success is context dependent
Mm-hmm.
based on species and what the environment they're in. So there are studies that show an increase in breeding success, but also some that show a reduction in breeding success. When the feeding is occurring during breeding, the same is true. There are some examples of increases and also reductions uh, in the breeding success.
Did they explain why there were reductions in the breeding success in some of those
They
studies? I mean,
they
it's
go in.
intuitive that it would increase breeding success because you're supplementing food, but
Yeah.
why would it decrease it?
Well, it's it's not easy to put it all together because there's different reasons and
In different
lots of
studies.
studies.
Okay.
So just to give you some examples, the success often is because it's a nutritional supplement and it's matching the
Hey,
Hey, how are y'all doing?
well, I was trying to. Charlotte sent me an email and said you had difficulty with this, and I was trying to get back on here and see if it uploads. That's what she told me to do.
Yeah, I appreciate you doing that, Larry. We're not sure what happened. She's been in contact with the folks that made the platform, trying to figure it out. So we were trying to see if that would work, but also, if not, we would love to record with you guys again if we could work out a time to do it and you guys are willing.
Yeah, I'm sure we could do that. There's been a brood in the backyard a couple times. That's kind of cool.
Oh, good.
Yeah, that's very cool.
That's great news.
Well, you want me to go ahead and X out and then see if it uploads and let you know by email or however? Email Charlotte or?
Yeah, that'll be fine. Yeah, if you close out, see what happens, and then just let Charlotte know, whatever you see or don't see, I guess.
Okay. All right. Good to see you guys.
All right. Thank you, Larry.
Yep. Appreciate it, Larry.
Take care.
Good to see you too.
What are the chances?
We just got, what do you even call it? Like, podcast bombed by Larry Van Gilder. What are the chances we're in the middle recording an episode and just Larry Van Gilder drops in?
Yeah. Hey guys, what's up?
I saw that little screen.
The godfather of wild turkey research just happened to drop in the middle of our episode.
Well, I saw that little window open up that somebody was joining the call, and I was like, oh, shoot, like Charlotte must have had to come in to say something, or maybe it was an accident, and then Larry Van Gilder pops up. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. And you can't just tell him to leave. I mean, he's Larry Van Gilder.
I know. So, a lot of this work that has been focused on songbirds with feeders they've really covered the gamut on how feeders could affect things positively and negatively. And, that's why I'm a little bit hesitant to say this is happening or that's happening, because the context matters a lot. And honestly, I don't know what will happen with turkeys because of that.
Mm-hmm.
Because of, it's hard to decipher in all these other studies how that might apply to a different species in a different setting and everything, especially after there's been so much literature showing that matters.
Mm-hmm.
However, there were a couple of other things that I found particularly noteworthy. I don't know how much they apply to turkeys, but I think it's worth our while to bring it up in the conversation. So one of those things, there was a study, it was Malpass, I guess that's how you say the name, Malpass et al., 2017, and they were looking at nest predators and nest survival. Not of turkeys, of American robins and northern cardinals, two things that frequent backyards, right? And they were looking at neighborhoods that had a whole bunch of feeders, bird feeders, versus neighborhoods that did not have many or none. And they were looking specifically at a couple of avian nest predators, namely crows and cowbirds.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know much about cowbirds other than they predate nest and also parasitize nest. So
I actually didn't know they predated nest. I just knew they parasitize them.
Yeah, they apparently do both. They talk about it a lot in this paper, The Biology of Species. They didn't focus on the parasitism part where they put eggs in something else's nest. But they did talk about predation, like they were focused on that here. And I found this when I was trying to find stuff on adult predation, which, by the way, I did not find any study at all looking at adult predation. I don't think I mentioned that earlier.
As influenced by feeding.
Right. I did not find one single paper linking the two together. So it doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, but there's no data that I can find on it. I suspect in the bird feeder literature there would be some attempts to look at that. So I'm kind of surprised there's no data points.
Yeah.
Tells me it probably is minor. But in this case, when they had a lot of feeders, we know, I know, the studies show it. Crows are really common around a corn feeder. They're when crows were using the bird feeders, that resulted in a much higher nest loss for robins to predation. And there's a couple of reasons that I want to talk about that as it relates to turkeys. So what they demonstrated in this study is when there were few feeders and few crows, the robbing nesting or probability of nest success was 34% in their study. When they had many feeders and many crows associated with it, so we're talking about a 3 times almost increase in the amount of crows associated with the most, the highest
With
density
areas that
feeding.
had a high density of feeders.
Yeah, so 3 times as many crows. The probability of the nest surviving to fledging went from 34% for the robin nest to 1%.
What? 1%?
Yes. So it was a pretty big change. Now, let's think about that from the perspective of turkeys. We know they nest on the ground, right? Everybody knows that.
Far
We
as I can
also
tell.
know that crows eat their eggs. They've been documented in some studies. We also know that crows frequent feeders. And we also know the hen needs to leave the nest basically daily during the day. So that's been that part of it with the nest predation issue. I've been a little bit uncomfortable with trying to think through how the feeder might affect nest predation, because the things we've been focused on, like raccoons, are nocturnal primarily, and the hen is on the nest at night and presumably to some degree defending it. And I've just been wondering about whether or not that would actually translate into more predation.
Mm-hmm.
But if the hen is leaving the nest, particularly to go to a feeder, and I mean, corvids in general are extraordinarily smart. And we have documentation of species connecting food availability to behavior of other species, or just like the individual itself, or unique things. Like we have examples where crows drop hickory nuts or something. I can't think of what it was. It was a hard seed on pavement to get a car to run over it so they can eat it out of it. All right. We've got all these examples of tool use. Like they're incredibly smart.
So they can connect
you got
dots.
A hen that is visiting a feeder on her daily nest excursion. I could see them picking up on that and knowing where the nest is, and then as soon as she's gone, it's vulnerable. And I don't. That hasn't been demonstrated, but I'm thinking that was noteworthy as something that we should think about, because that would align all the timing issues. And apparently with robins, it did matter. It's a pretty large amount. So. The other thing that I thought was particularly noteworthy, and I can't remember if he did it on the air, but I have certainly heard him talk about it at great lengths. Mike Chamberlain has talked about it, and maybe even some other researchers, how there is a bias in poults to male. And we've talked about reasons why that might be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there was one study.
Not at the hatching stage, but at the following.
Basically, when we do a poult survey or look at 28 days, there's a skew toward males, which we've talked about reasons, and it's primarily been about the male poults growing faster and being more fit to outcompete
and then driving habitat selection, resource use by the hen.
Yeah. So there's reasons to believe that males might be a little more fit to make it through the gauntlet, so to speak, than a female. But I found a paper that was looking at feeding, and in this case, they were trying to supplement female cockapoos. Don't read much about that.
I thought that was a type of dog.
Well, maybe it's cockapoo. It's Kakapos. Tomato, right? I don't know. Anyway, this species is endangered, and one of the problems associated with the species is because of habitat loss or whatever. There's problems in nutrition. So one of the ways that we're trying to improve things for the species and recover the species is to provide supplemental feed that's high quality to get females to a size that they can become reproductive, because there's kind of a size threshold. It's a little bit different than turkeys. But I found it really interesting because I had not even considered this before. One of the problems that they found in this study is when they fed females and a really high quality diet leading up to reproduction, they would get to a size where they were much more likely to invest in males than females, and they ended up with a skewed sex ratio in the eggs that were produced toward male. And I just thought that was really interesting, especially given the context of turkeys, knowing that they are skewed. And I just, we don't have any evidence whatsoever, to be clear, that is an influence in turkeys. I have not seen any data on that. Maybe there's something in the poultry literature on how diet quality affects sex ratio. That might be a place for us to kick around in just to look. But I just found that pretty intriguing. And it also shows me how complex some of these things could be, right?
Yeah, I doubt that would be acting in turkey populations, though, because, I mean, most of what's being fed is corn. And as we'll get into in just a little while with this other paper, that's probably not corn doesn't have the best nutritional profile to influence reproduction that substantially. So,
Yeah.
but it is interesting nonetheless.
Yeah. Well, I found it interesting. In this study, the diet was high quality, and it,
Yeah,
they were trying
match
to
to
match
needs.
the needs exactly. Yeah. But still interesting fodder to kick around in the
Yeah, for
old
sure.
noggin. So let's go ahead. Let's talk about turkeys. We got a
All right,
paper.
about time.
Well, we probably have at least 3 or 4 listeners still on here.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the turkey research paper that we uncovered after Jason reached out to us.
Yeah, so it's is it, how do you say that? Petit and Besom? Pate?
Sure. Patty?
They already our listeners already know that we screw up everybody's name. But the title, which I am capable of reading and properly pronouncing, is Supplemental Feeding to Increase Wild Turkey Productivity. I can
Yep.
get my head around that.
And this is indeed the paper that I recalled uncovering at some point in the past and could not find again until Jason sent us the corresponding dissertation.
Yeah. So let's set the stage for this paper. South Texas.
Yep.
King Ranch specifically.
Yep.
So semi-arid environment, very rainfall dependent. We've talked about that many times on this show, in the Texas specific episode with Jason, and then other times as well when we talk about how rain influences vegetation communities and how that drives such significant variation from one year to the next in pulp production.
Yeah. Well, not just pulp production, but also, you remember when we talked to Jason, we both found it pretty intriguing that the timing of nesting was changing pretty substantially, and the investment of hens in nesting.
Yeah, so some in poor rainfall years, i.e. no vegetation to speak of, a lot of hens don't even attempt.
That's right. Yep. So, different system from what the rest of the range of turkeys are dealing with, but definitely some intriguing things in this paper.
So they had 2 study areas in this study, and each of those was 5,000 hectares, which we did the math. It comes out to about 20 square miles per study area.
Pretty big.
Yeah, it's a really big area. So basically, the way they did this is.
Are you sure you did that math right? You remember what happened with the Alabamas?
Well, you're the.
I'm kidding with you. Go ahead.
All right. Yeah, so that's like 12,500 acres, I believe, for people that don't speak square miles.
Yeah.
So they had these 2 study areas, and they conducted.
Yeah, no, one thing I want to add, there was a buffer in the middle that they did not
Mhm.
include as the
That is
study
important.
areas. It's a couple of miles, like 2 miles
Yep.
between.
That is important.
Yeah.
So they had these 2 areas, and they had a pre-treatment year where they collected data. And they were looking at indices of turkey abundance by driving along permanent road transects. So each of these road transects were 47 kilometers long on each area. That would probably come out to about, was it 30 miles, maybe?
Something like that. Long
And
transects.
and so they went along these transects during the summertime, and they documented all adult turkeys seen as well as poults and their ages, and they looked at the number of turkeys on each area, and they looked at the number of poults, average brood size, and the percent of hens with poults.
Mm-hmm.
So they did that for 1 year, and then the
Yeah.
second year of.
So that's like the baseline data, just
Mhm.
getting how do the areas
Yep.
compare to one another without
Right.
any influence from a treatment. In this case,
Right.
is going to be supplemental feeding.
Exactly. Right. So then year 2, they take one of the sites and they supplemental feed it. That's the treatment. And one of the sites they leave unfed during year 2.
Mm-hmm.
So I ran some numbers on this too, as far as the feed amount that they were putting out. Well, before I say that, they were not feeding just a grain. They were feeding a commercial pelleted turkey breeder ration that was comprised of 17.5% protein, 2.25% calcium, and 0.75% phosphorus. And so this is a feed that is more well matched to
Mm-hmm.
actual turkey needs. And they would start feeding. They started feeding the first site in year 2 in February, and then they continued feeding for 100 days
Mm-hmm.
during the treatment year. So within that time period, on that site that was being treated, they put out what equates to. Well, I'll just read what they put first, and then I'll do my conversions. They put out 45 kilograms of feed per day at 10 to 15 sites on the treated area. So they had it distributed throughout the treated area, and they put the feed in areas that they knew that turkeys oftentimes frequented just based on local
Mm-hmm.
knowledge. And so that comes out to the feeding treatment being being treated with 50 pounds of feed per square mile per day. And over that entire 100-day period, that comes out to about 100,000 pounds of feed per year.
Mm-hmm.
And
The area is so large.
you're right, the area is so large. But
That
the reason.
actually, I just thought about it. What isn't it? Wasn't it a sack a day per day in the
Mhm,
South Carolina survey
mhm.
of corn?
Yeah,
So it's pretty
that's
similar.
about what it seems like people are feeding
Yeah.
in that area. But again, and I know this isn't the point you were making, but I just want to remind listeners that this was not corn. This was
Yeah. This
a
was a high quality
commercially
supplement.
available turkey ration. But I think it's important to cover that scope and scale of that treatment to give folks an idea of. And there's some that overall they saw a positive impact, and we'll get into that in just a second.
Mm-hmm.
We have some questions about their ability to come to that conclusion based on the study design. But if
Yeah,
you
I
take
wanted
it
to add this study was done in the mid 70s.
right,
And, we've talked about some other studies at that time and the technology and rigor expectations and everything are different than they are now.
and our understanding of experimental design too.
Right, right.
But yeah, so I wanted to point out if you just take the positive results that they reported at face value, and let's just put all the caveats aside, I wanted to make it evident the scope and scale that this practice was implemented at to elicit that response. And so that came out to 100,000 pounds of feed per season per site. I looked up, and some various commercial poultry feeds, and I'm sure you could get a discount on it if you were buying it in that kind of quantity. But if you're just buying it in a bag, it's about $25, $27 a bag. So that came out to them spending about $68,000 a year just on feed, not including the personnel and the mileage to put it out.
Mm-hmm. That's substantial.
Yeah.
And that's only for that narrow window of time too, right?
That's right. That's right.
Wow. Man, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
Probably the same amount in travel, to be honest with
Right.
you. Certainly
So-
when you add personnel into it.
So you want to jump into the results?
Yeah, I think so. Well, let's talk about a couple of the caveats real quick.
Okay.
One, they don't have any replication. They at least do have the before-after control impact design, but they've only got 2 areas.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that made it very difficult, and we've been digging around in this thing, folks, trying to figure out how to interpret their results. It's hard to interpret because they also have a crossover design nested
Right.
within it. And I know you know what I mean, but I'm not sure if everybody will, so I'll try to explain it. They essentially have a pair of areas. They got a baseline. Then they implemented a treatment, in this case feeding, on one of those areas, followed all the metrics for that year, and then they crossed the design such that the other area became the fed and the one that was fed initially became unfed,
Mm-hmm.
which made it very difficult to track down exactly what was happening and whether or not, to what degree we should trust this.
Yeah.
I guess.
The other major caveat that I'll point out is that the sample size of broods, and this is important because a lot of their conclusions were based on their observations of those broods.
Mm-hmm.
And remember that each of these study areas is 20 square miles, and their sample size of the number of broods that they observed on a given site in a given year was only about 10 to 14. So 10 to 14 broods across 20 square miles. And the one exception to that is that there was 1 year on one site where they based their observations off of 51 broods.
Yeah.
But in all other years, all other sites, the greatest number of broods they observed was 14.
Yeah, and the one with 51, like that, especially in the amount of data they have, is a real outlier that affects things, especially statistically, a lot.
Yeah, sure. So, for example, in that year that they observed 51 individual broods, they observed 220 individual poults, compared to the highest sample size from any other year or site was 65.
Mm-hmm.
And in most years, it was around 20 to 40 poults that they observed in a given treatment study area.
Yeah. Yeah. They're also they're not tagging birds and, using some of our more current methods that we use to get better estimates of poult per hen. But that being said, we do use a similar type of data at the state level. Mm-hmm. So it's not
roadside brood surveys.
Yeah,
that's exactly what they did.
We're trying to express to people to be cognizant of the limitations of the study, not throw it out with, it's not, that's why we're covering it. We're not throwing it out, but you need to realize that we probably need to do this better and in more places for sure to kind of fully understand whether or not it applies in different contexts or whether or not we see the same effect, because I'm not super convinced that there is an effect even in this study. But go ahead.
All right. So starting with the primary finding, they found approximately 270% more poults on the treated than the untreated area in 1975 and 1976. And treated areas had approximately 230% more hens with poults than untreated areas had in both years. Average brood size was also consistently higher on the treated areas.
Mm-hmm.
One other key finding that they reported was that estimated hatching dates indicated that timing of hatching, which was usually around mid-May, in both areas was similar during pre-treatment, whereas hatching peaks were dissimilar after treatment. And specifically, data from 1975, which was based on 10 broods, again, context,
Mm-hmm.
in 1976, which was based on 18 broods, revealed that poults appeared to hatch earlier and over a longer time period on the treated areas. For example, no poults hatched after June 15 on the treated areas, but broods that hatched as late as July 13 were observed on the treated areas.
Yeah. So, like you said, without the caveats, that sounds really, really good.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's a substantial difference in poult production at face value.
If you put out $68,000 worth of feed per year per site across 20 square miles.
Yeah, in a really drought-stricken area. They did say somewhere in here there were a number of things that they presume to be limiting nutritionally turkeys in that environment. It makes sense. However, did you look at Figure 1? This is regarding when the broods hatched time-wise.
Right.
And I know that you looked at it because we talked about it, but the timing thing is kind of a stretch for a few reasons.
Yeah.
One, they backdated the poult age from when they saw them.
So they saw a poult on the roadside and they estimated its age and thus estimated its hatching date.
Yeah. So that's a little bit suspect, but regardless of that, the small sample size in 76, when they said it was longer, it basically kind of looks like a bell-shaped curve. Go look at the paper. We'll have it linked if you want to see what we're talking about, and if you're watching us on YouTube, we'll cut it in. It looks kind of like a bell shape that's starting to develop, which is what I would expect it to look like largely, maybe slightly left truncated, but more or less you'd have a few individuals that are relatively early compared to everybody, and then you'd have a kind of a peak, and then you'd have some that are relatively late.
Yeah. And usually, when we observe things that are chronological like this, if you collect enough data, you'll always see a bell curve, whether it be turkey nest dates or, looking at the whitetail rut, it's a bell curve in breeding dates.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the way that traits work in populations when they're not being strongly selected against.
Right.
So anyway, that is a little bit suspect because
and the reason it was like that during that year was that was the year that they had 220 poults observed.
Right. So they had a relatively large sample size in that year, and it starts to look like a bell shape. And the reason I'm bringing that up is if you look particularly in 74, it looks like if you actually kind of impose that bell shape upon that distribution of data, then it would be earlier before there was any feeding going on, assuming that they didn't have any data before that.
Yeah. I mean, we can't say that that's actually how it was, but
given the sample size and the fact that I would have expected that curve, and then when we get to a relatively high sample size, we start to see it, it makes me question a little bit about this timing.
Yeah. And then there's
same thing with the late breeding. I would expect as you increase sample size, you'd start to pick up some of those more rare individuals in the population, and you'd get later breeding dates because some are just relatively late.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit skeptical about the timing.
Right. And then you jump down to 1975 and there's essentially no trend there.
Yeah. And that also spells small sample size to me. This is one of the reasons it's really important with this kind of work to have replication of sites. Like if they had many pairs or at least 3 or 4 pairs, you'd start to, even with the smaller sample size that they were dealing with, you'd get a little better handle on what's going on, like what's truly going on in the population. But
right.
So another thing that stuck out to me is while the poult production, even though, given the limitations that we've talked about, there does seem to be a treatment effect. Like feeding does seem to result in more poults. I mean, the effect size is really big.
Yeah.
So,
And if there was anywhere that was going to respond to feeding, you would expect it to be South Texas.
yes,
For the
exactly.
reasons you
So
mentioned
high
briefly a
quality
minute ago.
feed in a really poor quality environment.
Yeah.
But they noted it somewhere, and also when we were going through it, we kind of came to this conclusion. There did not seem to be the shared pattern of recruitment into the adult population.
Right. So in other words, in the one site that was fed in the middle year, 1975, you would expect that dramatic increase in pulp production that they reported to carry over into the number of hens that were present on that site the following year, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's our intent, right? Is to get these birds to adults
Yeah.
so they can either be hunted if they're males and then contribute to the population if they're females. But that wasn't the case. We didn't see basically the treated site in 1975 had 150 hens on it. And then the next year it went up a little bit, but not as much as the site that went from wait, let me back up. You spelled this out a lot better than I did earlier, so why don't you take it?
Well, and the confusion is warranted because it took us a while to figure out this crossover design and how to interpret it.
So they saw a 30% increase. I've got it. Luckily, I wrote it down because I knew my brain wouldn't keep track with it. But they saw a 30% increase in hens after they quit feeding on one site.
Yeah, so in other words, they had a 30% increase in the number of adult hens observed when they went from feeding to not feeding.
Yes.
And that was when the site that went from not feeding to feeding was 25%, right?
Right.
So it's probably just a better year.
So it's probably just
driving that
annual
pattern.
variation in reproduction.
But actually, it doesn't seem to be linked to feeding at all.
Right.
Which is surprising to me given what the apparent effect on reproduction was. So either that's noise, it's not a true effect, or there's some sort of compensatory mechanism working where, you get more through the brood stage, but that just means more of them die later in the fall anyway.
Yeah.
So something's happening, and it's, again, this is the one paper we can find trying to link it to vital rates, and it does indicate a positive response in that environment. But there are some limitations with the study that make me wonder if it truly was a response or not. And I think what it does tell me is that there probably are some contexts where feeding, especially when you look at the broader literature, where feeding could have a positive effect. But we need to work on that and try to basically fully understand all the things going on to understand when that would be.
Yeah. So you mentioned, a compensatory mortality cause. So that may seem a little bit abstract. So just to think through it, maybe we produce a lot more poults, we get them through summertime, but then when fall and winter rolls around, you've got all these additional mouths on the landscape, or maybe even you have all these additional birds on the landscape, especially in a place like South Texas that is roost limited. Maybe there's not enough quality roost sites to support all those birds, or maybe there's just not enough, mast over winter time to support those birds.
Yeah.
And so perhaps
So
they die.
by increasing survival in one life stage, you end up decreasing survival commensurate with that in a different life stage.
Right. So perhaps they die because they're pushed into a suboptimal, roosting area. Maybe they don't have enough food, or maybe they just disperse the site because those resources are limited. So they disperse and they go somewhere else.
Yeah.
And that was another important point that I wanted to make is not only would trying to implement this practice on a smaller property probably not convey as much benefit because you're not feeding across such a large scale and benefiting a larger population, but also even if you do manage to increase your pulp production as a result of feeding a nutritionally matched diet during that period leading up to nesting, or a nutritionally appropriate diet during that period, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get to keep all those birds that you produced as a result of that. And that's the same. You could say the same thing about habitat management practices
I was
too,
just
right?
about
To be fair,
that. But it's also important for you to think about trying to get into some sort of cooperative with your neighbors to try to all be
Absolutely.
doing things to improve turkeys for whether it's habitat or whatever. So, yeah, I think it's good for us to again cover this kind of work. We did the same thing with the predation stuff, but because of when it was done and the limitations and technology and everything at the time, it leaves me wanting.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it would translate to eastern populations because their environmental constraints and those two are so different. I don't know. There's so many unknowns, I guess.
Right.
Not just about the quality of this work and whether or not it's a true response, but also how translatable will it be to other places.
Right. Absolutely. Well, interesting stuff nonetheless.
Yeah. Yeah. The until I see a better version of this over more areas, I'm still concerned.
Right.
Even, and that was something that Jason brought up when we were emailing back and forth. We should all expect that there could be positives, but the question is whether or not the positives outweigh the negatives. So I think we have stronger evidence, indirect evidence, that there are some negatives to worry about. What we don't have is how the negative and positive weighs out, in different contexts.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to do some work to connect, baiting and supplemental feeding to vital rate responses. I think that is where we're at still.
Unfortunately.
So,
you got anything else?
No, I think that's pretty well covering it. I know, we're trying to do our best to cover everything, and if folks find more stuff, we'll come back to it.
Yep.
But I kind of feel like we've been belaboring the feeding conversation here for a while.
We'll move on. I think we're moving on now.
We've got some good ideas for content, especially that is relevant at this time of the year on the top of a lot of people's minds. So, but again, if you guys find something out there, you want us to discuss other aspects of this, just let us know. The feedback has been really awesome, and I really value it and appreciate it. So thanks everybody out there for listening and engaging.
Yeah, I appreciate it too. And one other thing that I want to throw out there, and I haven't thought about this in quite a while, but folks really enjoyed when we did that episode on how to research and kind of that process that we go through. And I know that this time of the year, a lot of our listeners are the core of our listener base, right? Like the people that think about turkeys year round. But if y'all want some more of those episodes that aren't necessarily like literature heavy, always directly focused on turkeys, maybe more big picture or related to some other aspect of wildlife science or our jobs, let us know that too, and we can throw some of those in the mix every now and then, because that, like I said, that other one seemed to be pretty popular.
Yeah. Well, I did get one comment or request. I'm not sure the way it was structured, what exactly it would be classified as, but there was a high school aged person that was interested in understanding how to get into the field.
Yeah.
So even that could be a really good one, especially if we've got some younger listeners or some listeners that are interested in changing career paths or whatever.
Sure. Well, cool. I just reached down, felt something poking me in the leg, and I realized I'm still getting sandburrs out of my pants from Nebraska.
I thought you were going to say it was pocket corn.
No, I keep that in a little Crown Royal sack.
Yeah.
I don't want to get my pockets dirty.
It's really good gun rest, too.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.